Example.
Good. See that what you saw yesterday. Use the hand. I took you and you had
Exactly.
Good. And they have two books. Okay. Thank
So
you.
much. Wow.
You look like something else. So,
Priya Swamy के बारे में थोड़ा सा दो चार शब्द सुनिए. So Priya Swamy is curator globalization at South Asia at World Museum. Her research and curatorial work try to think differently about diaspora cultures by focusing on stories that are often silenced or ignored. Her focus has been mostly on the legacies of Asian indentured labor, not only to deepen solidarities or historical understanding across various South Asian diasporas, but to understand these legacies and objects as belonging to multiple places. She writes articles, curates exhibition, and co-concepts community-based project Wildlife Music. It's a very big introduction of her. And now I request Priya to start her today's talk that based on the traces of Bhojpuri culture in Indo-Caribbean contemporary art.
Thank you so much. Here. This one? Do we have to aim this one? Okay, you can go. I didn't do my introduction. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I would like to thank very deeply the DG for inviting me, Momita Ghosh for setting up the details. Momita and I have been in contact for many years, actually, trying to arrange a visit to do work together, so it feels wonderful to be here. And I was lucky to welcome the DG 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, to our museum in Amsterdam, where we had, I think, a really productive and exciting visit around our galleries. And he was so kind as to extend an invitation at that time. And here we are. So a real pleasure to be here. We're just waiting a little bit on my clicker, yeah?
Yes, also can start.
I can start talking because, I know what I need to say. Momita already touched on it, but I wanted to reinforce one of the reasons why I'm giving this talk in this way today. And that word solidarities came up. So the idea that we, coming from South Asian communities, we can also say today coming from different parts of India, often we may not understand each other's histories as deeply as would help us to understand and relate to each other better. I have done most of my research for the past 20 years on Indians who have made their lives in the Caribbean area. And one of the reasons why I did that was because growing up in Canada, where I grew up, I didn't really understand why there were Indian people in the Caribbean as a child. And when I would ask my parents or their friends, they also didn't know the answer. They didn't understand the historical reasons. They didn't know how to talk about contract labor, as we call it in English. And as I grew older, I actually went to study South Asian studies and religions. And that's when I started to learn and understand the history of contract labor and indentured labor related to, of course, British colonialism. So this was not until, my late teens, early 20s. And then I sort of said, I made a commitment to myself that I was going to start studying very seriously diaspora communities so that younger generations can understand the history better and therefore understand themselves better. It's all about, I think, relating to each other in different ways. I have to say also, growing up in Canada, there were tensions, one could say, stereotypes about Indians that had grown up in the Caribbean versus Indians who had grown up here on the subcontinent. As we also have stereotypes between South Indians and North Indians and Gujus and this, we all know what those can be, and often those comes from just not understanding histories properly. So in order to break those stereotypes, I've started humbly doing this kind of research. So this is a kind of contribution in that way. And just a little note on the title, I have Bhojpuri culture, but it's really Bhojpuri culture and beyond. There's relations to Mithila culture, Mithila painting, Madhubani in my talk as well that we're going to bring up. So I wanted to start and say that I will be speaking from that context of the Caribbean where I've done my research. Suriname, which is a country in South America. Actually, very interestingly enough, there's debate about whether it is actually in the Caribbean or not because it is mainland South America. But because of the history and culture, it is often considered part of the Caribbean. Just so you know that there is some debate around it. So what happens when we leave? When we leave one place and we go to another? That's essentially my question when I'm talking about diaspora histories. And at the museum, this is a question that comes up very often where I work. And what I want to show today is that art and artistic forms really respond to what's happening around them. So while I'm talking about traces of Bhojpuri culture, it doesn't travel completely unmoved from one place to another. As we understand, culture is never static. It's always interacting, it reinvents itself. It's very, very strategic almost in a way. If you think about really early migration out of India into parts of the Caribbean in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were lots of constraints about what one could do with their bodies, what one could do with their religious practices, their music, their dance. So they had to adapt to life on the plantation, for example, and after the abolition to the space that they're in. So things naturally had to change. But that doesn't mean that the essences and the ideas and also the devotion and the commitment to these cultures were not there. So I want to sort of talk about layers, if we think of a metaphor. The Caribbean as a layered space with layers that interact upon each other, that come together in different ways, and the Indian layer is one of many, and we're going to pull it out and see it today. So I work in a World Cultures Museum, as we call it, and I think that this institution operates in kind of similar ways. There are archaeological collections. We also do contemporary collecting. So we have a very strong collection of contemporary arts. We also commission contemporary artists as well. And we also have collections of what we would call everyday objects. Now, what's very important about the institution I work for is that it's the former colonial institute of the Netherlands. So a lot of what they collected was collected during the period of colonialism. And that means we have very strong, big collections from Indonesia and from parts of the Caribbean that were former Dutch colonies. We also have South Asia collections, collections from the continent of Africa, but the museum really began as an Indonesia-based collection and a Caribbean collection. So when we are making content now in the contemporary, we always want to reflect back on that colonial history because there is the inevitability of the fact that a lot of the stuff in our collection might have been taken in a context of inequality that colonialism naturally brings up. And we know the debates that are happening today around restitution, giving objects back. We in the World Museum are at the forefront of that, thinking through how to restitute objects, when to restitute them, and being in conversation with institutions in different parts of the world. So that's also something that really frames the work I do on the Caribbean. And my interest in the Caribbean as a layered space is the specific colonial history and making sure I can communicate this to a Dutch audience, for example, that doesn't necessarily learn about this in school. So the history of Indian indentured labor is not something that you learn in high school or through textbooks. If you choose to take a course that some of my very esteemed colleagues might teach, that I used to teach, you might get that history, but without that, It's something that you could say is kind of silenced or unknown to this point. And there's lots of people who are making efforts to put it on the map. And I think our museum is pushing that through as well. The history of our museum also means that collecting from diaspora communities was really frowned upon. People didn't do it. So what's interesting is the collections from Suriname are indigenous collections and collections of maroon objects. So maroon objects refer to formerly enslaved people who would have left plantations, run away from plantations, and gone into the interior of Suriname to hide and create a new life for themselves. The interior of Suriname is very, very hard to navigate, so it was very easy to, kind of give a slip to some of these owners of plantations. But the logic was, if you wanted objects related to India, you would get them from India, because that is a place of authenticity. The same thing went for Indonesia, because there were laborers who were also recruited from Java in Indonesia who came to Suriname. But we don't have big Javanese Surinamese collections either. The idea was, if we wanted something from Indonesia, we'll go to Indonesia. So museums like mine, so that includes museums like the British Museum, they had a really static idea of authenticity, which I think we thoroughly need to break if we want to understand how culture actually operates, right? So again, this idea of staticness. And so when I do my work and I do my collections, I'm very interested in collecting Indian objects from outside of India for this social political reason related to how we collect in the museum. Very quickly, I know I'm talking a lot about history and concept right now, but it's just to frame this. Indentured labor from India started in Suriname. The first boat left in 1873 and arrived in Paramaribo, and continued pretty steadily until 1916. With indentured labor, there's a lot of discussion around how do we classify it? Because yes, technically, people signed contracts, right? But in many cases, people didn't really understand what they were signing contracts for. They didn't even know where they were going. If we think about, especially in those times, there were a lot of taboos around movement, what happens to you, what happens to your sense of community if you leave a space and go to another one. A lot of people would have been apprehensive to make such a long sea journey, right? So people, they weren't told they were going to cross the sea. They weren't told they were going to this place that was on the other side of the world. They were told very convenient stories about where they were going to go, and sometimes outright lied to. There is the historical case of people being kidnapped and taken to embarkment points and put on ships. There is also the flip side of that story, where people who wanted to get out of situations of poverty, of famine, often women who were escaping domestic violence and in equal circumstances, also would sign up for the ship. So it really, there's a lot of ambivalence around how to classify it. But one thing that's very important to understand is that it's directly related to the abolition of transatlantic slavery. So enslaved Africans being taken to plantations all around the world, in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean world, to do basically hard labor, forced hard labor. When that was abolished, they needed a very quick, cost-effective solution to keep the plantations running, because it was extremely lucrative. Human necessity for things like sugar, for salt, coffee, skyrocketed in the colonial period, and they needed to be able to fulfill this demand. So the idea of taking laborers from India, from other colonies, and bringing them to other places to do the work was set up. So also, a lot of the ways in which I think through this is, what is the connection, what are the shared histories between formerly enslaved Africans living in the Caribbean and their descendants, and descendants of Indian indentured laborers now living in the Caribbean, how to share that history. And there's a lot of contestation around that. A lot of people who, very rightly, these are painful, difficult things to talk about. But there are groups of people who are trying, for the sake of solidarity and understanding, to see these two moments as linked. Now, when I talk about the linkages, I really want us to think about everyday life in a place like Suriname. This is a market in a place called Lelydorp, circa 1920. This is a photo from our archive at the World Museum. And I think this demonstrates beautifully this idea of the layeredness of cultures, peoples, and history, because you see people coming from different communities in this one photo. So people on the ground, you see Indian, we can call Indian or descendants of Indians here. Very interesting, in Dutch, they use the word Hindustani to refer to this community. And Hindustani specifically for Indians from Suriname. But someone like me, they'd be like, yeah, you're from India, you're an Indian. That's different. So it's very specific. And labor was recruited from UP and Bihar almost exclusively in Suriname, which would have been the United Provinces, also known as Hindustan in that time. So I think it comes from that history. But you also see Afro-Caribbean women on the right-hand side wearing the long white dress and the headscarf. Sorry, I have to think of that word in English, headscarf. And market spaces were real spaces of interaction. This is where everyday life really happened. This is where the buying and selling of food, exchange of gossip. I mean, think of markets today, right? They bring a lot of different kinds of people together, and they're part of like the social space. They're part of social public space.
Railway line at that point of time?
Yes, this is 1920. Yeah.
1920. And who did that railway line? Indentured labor or before?
I think it's before, and I think the Dutch put it on. I'm not sure exactly who built the railroad. That is a really good question. I can find that out for you. This is a picture of a Ram Lila performance on the way to Paramaribo, which is the capital city of Suriname. And this is circa 1927 or before 1927. I mean, the photo was taken in 1927. Another, really beautiful example. Again, if we're talking about traces of culture, Ram Lila and worship around Ram is super big in the Caribbean. The largest statue of Hanuman outside of India is actually in Trinidad. And it's huge. It's really huge in a temple in Trinidad. Also, if you travel to Mauritius, you see this as well. And Suriname is no exception. The Ram Lila performance continues to be done in Suriname. Also in the Netherlands, I've seen it. Not as common, but it does happen. And what we have also in our collection as a remnant of these kinds of performances are the masks that would have been used, that were made. Now, this mask is dated to before 1950 in Suriname, and we have 3 of them, and this is on display in our gallery in Amsterdam. And for me, it's a very interesting piece because, like I said earlier, there isn't a huge collection of material culture that relates to Indian culture in Suriname. But these masks are there, and they tell a really interesting story of how the culture of the Ramayana, the Ram Lila performance travels and continues, and we have this here. It's also a very interesting story if we want to think about how objects and stories belong to many places at once. Because this mask was made in Suriname. So it's part of the culture there that has already interacted, that has changed and adapted, and this is one thing that kind of comes up out of it. So I always say the Ramayana, it's a global story. You see it in Indonesia, you see it in the Caribbean, you see it in Mauritius. And this is a nice physical kind of testament to the globalization.
Who is Ram?
This is Ram. We have Hanuman, Ram, and Lakshmana in our collection.
Very interesting because in India, if you see the Ram, it doesn't have a mustache.
Oh, really?
And if he has no mustache, in India, and then you see that what is in his forehead.
Uh-huh.
That is Lord Shiva.
Right, that's true actually.
Yeah, so it's very interesting with mustache. We are also surprised in India. How come our gods don't have mustache? None of them have mustache. Here it's very powerful mustache.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things, right? When we're talking about how things change or adapt, these little embellishments, actually they're very significant. Because you're saying here, well, we would never do Ram with a mustache. In fact, we don't do our gods with facial hair. But perhaps someone who was making it, and we don't know who was making it, could have been an adult, could have been a child, was like, today my Ram is going to have a mustache. And then it becomes part of kind of a cultural production, and things kind of are innovated and changed. Remember, it's also human agency, right? We don't necessarily just blindly take what we learn and keep repeating it. We also have agency over how to adapt it to our social situation, to what our personal beliefs are, things like that. Which is also a really important story when you're talking about either descendants of Indian indentured labor, descendants of formerly enslaved Africans. Often we talk about these groups of people, these humans, as if they had no agency, as if they didn't have opportunities to innovate their cultures or moments of joy, where we know we have historical evidence that they do, and it's really important to emphasize those, so we emphasize their humanity as well. Now, I've talked a lot about, what we can see in the Caribbean, but there's also this idea of what isn't there. Momita mentioned this as well. I'm very invested in what is silence and what is not there. And often, and this is across history, I think a lot of people in this room will agree, women's history often gets pushed to the background, right? And a lot of the work I do relies on official archives. And a lot of the people who do the most interesting history have to work with national archives around numbers of people who migrated, stories from plantations. But those often tell the experiences of men. So there can be a lot of frustration around where are the stories of women? How do we understand what life was like for women? What was their role in these earlier times? We understand their role in the contemporary, but how did we get here, right? So I work with not only the archives, not only the objects, but also contemporary artists who are working really hard to be able to repair these gaps in history. And they do that through their practice, which is often multimedia. So some of them are doing performance, some of them are painting, some of them are building sculpture or making film, to kind of imagine through deep historical reading and understanding what their ancestors, their lives would have been like, especially their female ancestors and those legacies. And one thing that's very important for a lot of the artists I work with, is tracing those cultures. And especially with Indo-Caribbean artists, tracing where those Indian things come up and interact in different ways with different kinds of cultures. So it's never about isolating one thing, but understanding one thing in relationship to another. Contemporary art in general has become really important in our collections, and I just want to say something about this very quickly, and we can have a conversation around this. Because I mentioned, these are colonial collections, a lot of them. They're coming with a very specific historical context, and they also served a very specific political message. That's one thing also in our museum. We do not shy away from the political. We understand that everything is a political act. Making an exhibition is a political act. The fact that our collections are, so-called colonial collections that had a certain politics written into it. How to understand that, repair that, to critique that, has been to really engage with contemporary artists and artworks that can come in and comment on our collection. So that's why in a museum that people might think, oh, but isn't it more traditional if you're working with archaeology and things like that? Yes, in many ways. but we also want to make it very future oriented. So even though we share this colonial past, what is the future going to look like? And that's where we really look to contemporary artists to help us out. And today I want to talk about the work of Sarojini Lewis, Nazarena Rojan, two people whose work will actually be featured in the museum in a group show starting next week, and an artist from Trinidad named Tessa Alexander. Let's talk about traces. So Sarojini Lewis and I worked together in 2022 in my museum in Rotterdam. I also realized, it's very funny, I keep saying my museum, like I'm the owner of the museum where I work. Sarojini and I worked on an installation, and the translation of the title was, "Why is your face like a Karela?" And it was actually started from the idea of the vegetable, the bitter gourd, the Karela, and the importance it has in the Caribbean and in the Indian Ocean world. Sarojini, as an artist, takes the Karela not just as a vegetable. She wants to take it out of the kitchen and take it into the realm of memory. She uses it as a metaphor for her ancestors' journeys from India to Suriname, and then again from Suriname to the Netherlands. She's an artist who herself was born in the Netherlands, but has ancestry from India and the Caribbean. So think about the Karela. She said, I somehow have a connection with this vegetable. It's kind of weird shaped, it's green, it looks almost alien, right? It looks like something that doesn't belong. And how many of us as migrants can understand that feeling of just feeling like you don't belong? You look different, you're shaped differently, all of these kinds of things. And then there's the taste of the Karela. We know the Karela is very, very bitter. And it can only be tempered with spice, with sugar, with salt to become palatable. And she said, well, this is kind of what it's like to remember my ancestry. It's bitter. I didn't, my ancestry is about relationship to hard labor, very arduous sea journey going from India to Suriname, where a lot of people died, unfortunately, because of disease, because of violence on the ship, because of just the conditions of crossing the ocean at that time. So the bitterness also is something that she says it resonated with me as a metaphor. But we all somehow love that taste. The taste is delicious. The bitterness is also, it's an acquired taste. One thing we often joked about is that Karela is one vegetable that the British really couldn't colonize. They couldn't turn it into something in their own cuisine, could they? And you still see that today. Now they're marketing it as kind of like a health food, so bitter gourd juice and things, but it's still not super popular. Yet, the Karela, when it traveled into the Caribbean, became part of local national cuisine. So Afro-Surinamese people in Suriname also cook the Karela in a very different way, usually with dried fish, actually. They stuff it with salted fish and then fry it up. But also the more Indian way with spices, deep fried with onions, is also very popular. But in Suriname, it also gets its own name in the local language. They call it sopropo, which is the Afro-Surinamese language, Tranantongo, which is the national language of the country. And people still also refer to it as Karela. You can find it in Trinidad, you can find it in Mauritius as well. Basically, everywhere people went, they brought the seeds and it could grow it. And I was saying this earlier, the Karela is a very resilient vegetable. It can grow in any climate. I remember in Canada, where I grew up, my best friend's parents used to grow it in their garden, and it would grow every year. So that resilience is also a really beautiful metaphor about humanity, people moving and creating new worlds. So what she did with this Karela, she didn't eat it, she didn't cook it. We wanted to move completely out of that. She was doing performances with it. This is a still from a video she made with an artist named Daniel Lemmer, an Afro-Surinamese artist, on a plantation in Suriname. And they're doing what she refers to as kind of like a healing ritual, where they are using the Karela as a way that bonds the two of them and their histories. So again, this kind of layered and shared history, but through this trace that is very, very much an Indian trace that has come and made its way to the Caribbean. So this is one sort of way in which we could talk about the traces and layers. Nasrina Rojan's work, we worked together in 2023. She's another woman artist, grew up in the Netherlands of Indo-Caribbean descent. And she's very interested in traces that are in the archive and reimagining that archive in her oil paintings. So actually, this is a picture based on a postcard image that was very popular in the 19th and 20th centuries. They used to circulate these postcards, and they used to have the caption, beautiful woman, Indian belle, Indian woman, and also very controversially, I'm going to use this word in quotations, coolie woman. This is a word that is used to describe this community in the Caribbean. It's considered a very derogatory term. There are some parts of the Caribbean that have, you can say, reappropriated that word and use it in a different way. I try to avoid it, or if I use it in this way. But it refers to people who are doing hard labor.
There is a book on coolie women.
Yes, Coolie Woman by Gayatri Bahadur, who talks about reappropriating that word. That's the preface of the book. So if you're interested in that debate, it's very good. But what she does that's so brilliant is she takes images that would have been circulated on postcards, so very cheaply, kind of thrown on the table as tourist items, and she creates large-scale oil paintings. And she does that because in the Netherlands, at the time and earlier, oil paintings like this, portraits like this, were reserved for the very rich and the royal. So what she does is she creates kind of a sense of opulence around these women, to kind of rescue and repair this history of them being traded, often as over-sexualized objects, exotic women, and giving them a kind of sense of royal history. And what's very interesting, of course you can't see it here, is the scale of the works are really huge. And done in oil painting, you just get a completely different understanding of the archive. So these traces, especially around the ornamentation, so these pictures were usually taken as postcards because they thought it was very exotic that Indian women came with all of this jewelry. Oh, they're coming as workers, but they have so much jewelry. They didn't understand the importance of ornamentation in our cultures. And the importance of jewelry as kind of a source of wealth and a way of sort of making your way in the world. So she uses those traces and she reappropriates them, she redirects them in a sort of search for empowerment. Finally, and this might be perhaps the most interesting for people in the room if we're really talking about this region, is the work of Tessa Alexander, who is a Trinidadian artist who has Afro-Surinamese and Indo-Caribbean parentage. She also works with these postcard images, but if you see the background, she also works with Madhubani painting methods, as well as what's called Nigerian uli method, which she overlayers, where she's really using the border, she's using all of the space in the background as a way to honor her ancestry. And she has different kinds of archival images. Here is one of an Indian woman, but she also uses Afro-Surinamese women, encounters between these women on plantations. And this is part of a larger series she has called In Search of My Grandmother's Garden. And she says, quote, using colonial era images of subaltern women, often used as postcards, which fetishized othering by using dehumanizing or classification type titles, I disrupt both the flattening of women's lives and cultural identities, as well as Western art historical narratives. So using the Madhubani and using uli here as a way to disrupt this idea, this preference for European ways of doing painting. And again, also, I think what is very important here is what she says, the flattening of cultural identities, because the layering really gives us this larger than life kind of reality that often the archive likes to flatten. You have to identify as one or the other. The possibilities of being many things, there is no possibility often in the archive. But it's through painting like this, it's through the work of Nasrina, it's through the work of Sarojini that those opportunities kind of build themselves up. So I wanted to stop here so that we could have a conversation. So thank you very much.
Very good.
Sorry, I did that.
Yes.
Any also questions of? Oh,
Jewelries are made of what material? Gold or silver?
So mostly silver in the photographs that I've seen in our collection. There's a lot of silver, and we also have a lot of silver jewelry. Very rarely do I see gold.
So those Yoruba Muslim used to wear those silver jewelries and those back on.
Yes, but I think obviously, not while they were doing work. I think for a lot of these postcard images, they were staged portraits where they would ask the women to put all of their jewelry on to get that kind of effect. And I think especially on occasions, weddings, festivals, women would wear jewelry like that. But of course, it's not practical to think they were adorned like that while they were working. Yeah, of course.
What is Suriname right now? What is it like right now?
That's an amazing question. So actually, I haven't been to Suriname since 2017. I hope that I will be going next year. But Suriname is an extremely diverse place. And you can say that about, all these places in the Caribbean. You really go there and you see the layers. And one thing, when I first went to Suriname in 2012, I found so interesting is that they think about multiculturalism and diversity and those things completely differently than other parts in the world because it's so entwined. So I remember speaking to a man on the phone, and he told me, "Oh, well, I have family that's descendants from Indian. I'm Indian." And then I went to meet him, and I was like, "I don't see that you're Indian. I see that you're an Afro-Surinamese man." But then it's like, yes, I am Afro-Surinamese, and I'm indigenous, and I'm Indian, and I have all of these things inside me. So it's the and. Again, it's not the one or the other. And you really see that when you walk around the country and you go around, that everything is sort of layered and mixed in a way. That's not to say that politically and socially there aren't tensions between ethnic groups. After and leading up to independence, a lot of the times politicians weaponized ethnicity. So now political parties are actually stratified along ethnic lines. So there will be an Indian party, the VHP. There will be an Afro-Surinamese party, a Javanese party. So it's not that these things don't exist. It's not that racism doesn't exist. But if you look at the everyday, you see this kind of layering. It's also a beautiful place to go. It's, the Amazon runs through Suriname, it borders on Brazil. The interior nature, it's very, very beautiful. But they've also had a lot of unrest, social unrest, like many places after independence from Dutch colonization.
In case of Suriname, what we found that now what is it's like here also. Like people from Bihar migrated to Delhi, Mumbai, and they are sending some money because their part of family lives here still. In Suriname also I found that the elite who could educate, who could migrate, who can come to Netherlands, Amsterdam, Leiden or wherever, they are still keeping that contact on, trying to visit once in a year, trying and sending some money. Exactly, there is a parallel. So people who are working in Delhi, they are sending some money to people here, and they are coming once in church or something.
Yes, yes.
So you find that type of similarity. Because those people, you remember we had a dinner there somewhere.
Oh, yes, of course.
So that person was telling me, I found that there is still a tendency to keep that contact alive.
For sure.
It's not that they are not cutting off, because now they are in Amsterdam and Netherlands. They can forget also, but still they also want, so they have their own schools, those type of things, pandits, etc. So
Yeah.
very, very interesting.
It's very true.
That chutney music.
Exactly.
What is his name? Famous fellow, Rajkumar.
Raj Mohan, who did the singing, yes, Raj Mohan.
Here also.
Oh, yes.
We wanted him, but because of model code, we are not getting him.
Oh, no.
But so, lot of that contact is still.
Oh, yeah,
I don't know
absolutely.
how many generations it will remain. Because Bhojpuri now we are dramatizing, because when I went to Mauritius, what happened was that older generation in house, when they talk in home, they speak Bhojpuri. Otherwise, outside it's all Creole. The
Yeah.
younger generation does not speak Bhojpuri. And one very funny thing I found was some of the words in Bhojpuri are not spoken in Bhojpur now.
Ah,
Because
yes.
it got amalgamated and changed and all things. But maybe because island or something.
Yeah.
So those words are still there.
That, which is really interesting, right? You see that they speak.
That has words have gone from here, but it's not in India now. But they're there. Similarly, some food which is not very popular in India for that sense. Dal puri is not the most popular thing from Bihar. If you call it, will be litti or sattu or something. But somehow that is their national food.
That we're staying. Yeah, that's the thing.
Dal puri in India itself has gone down very, exceptly on some festivals
Yeah.
when we make dal puri. Otherwise, dal puri is completely out of our normal day.
No, I think that's very interesting as well, is that there are some things, you know, when people move, and that's kind of the particularity of diaspora, or maybe you can say the peculiarity, is that we hold on to certain things, but that because, you know, we migrated at a specific time, and so that's what we have in our heads, in our minds, in our hearts. So, and you see it through food. Language is a really interesting one too. So the language in Suriname among descendants of Indians, they speak a language called Sarnami Bol. It's basically Bhojpuri, but it has some local language in it. It has Dutch in it. Usually when people can't think of the word, they will use the Dutch word. But again, I think it's very old Bhojpuri, the vocabulary. But the fact that that language kind of still exists, that they're still using, because in other parts of the Caribbean, Indian Creole languages kind of fell away. But Suriname is very particular and very, you know, literature in the language, right? Adopting Devanagari at one point to write the language. The chutney music from Suriname will be in Sarnami Bol, actually.
So what part of your World Museum collection? So will it be, say, Caribbean thing will be 1%, 2% of collection?
I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what the percentage is, but like we have, you know, the Indonesia collection is what, I think, like
That's
500.
the largest.
Yeah, that's by far the largest, and it's something like 500,000 objects. The Caribbean is much less, but I mean 100,000, I could say, but I don't know how much of that would come from Suriname specifically, or how much of that would come from Hindustani collections, as we call them. But I think Suriname is quite well represented. But as I said, indigenous collections, maroon collections, tend to be what's mostly there.
So one question I have, how do you find balance in your day-to-day visitors, the Dutch visitors, and when you showcase your Indo-Caribbean collection to them, how their response and their feedback to you in terms of?
So that is a really good question, thanks. You know, it really depends on who's coming in. We get a really diverse audience of people. We get a lot of school visits, actually, to our new exhibition called Our Colonial Inheritances, which is where a lot, and I think some of the greatest pieces around Indo-Caribbean culture are on display. And like I said, a lot of them are getting the story for the first time. Well, I'll tell you a really interesting story. So we were doing a kind of promotion thing with quite a big kind of young singer in Amsterdam. And he was interested in knowing more about his roots because his mother came from Suriname. And they asked me to kind of give him a tour, and there would be a video camera, and we were going to film this episode. And I said, of course. So we came in, and you know, he said he was going to do this. And I asked him, so what part, like, which culture from Suriname are you from? And he didn't know. And then he told me his mom's name was Asha, named after Asha Bhosle. And I said, okay, so I'll tell you, I'm pretty sure you're Hindustani. And he's like, I don't know what that is, like I don't understand that. And so I said, okay, 5 minutes, I'm gonna walk you through this, we're gonna have a talk about this. Because all of these different groups of people migrated into Suriname. There were the indigenous people, but then, you know, enslaved Africans, this. And so I had to walk him through this history before we did the whole thing. And it was so interesting because from what I know, his mom and his grandfather was super into Bollywood music. I mean, you know, the Asha Bhosle thing, and he was like, I was playing songs on my phone. He's like, oh, I recognize this, I recognize this. It was so blatantly Indian, but there was no way that he could have known that. And it wasn't reinforced in school, it wasn't understood in that way. Also, you know, when you talk about Suriname, it's taken as if it's this monolith of culture. So you don't really understand through school, you just understand the national context, but not all the diversity within it, which makes it really difficult. So a lot of the time, people are coming in and learning from scratch. On the other hand, when we do have visits, especially people who come from specific communities, they're interested, they're critical, which is also really important. Often they will leave feedback via email or they'll talk to someone, but just having that history there, I think is really important to start. It's to start a conversation, we always say. So,
Okay.
yeah. Yes.
As you talked about Assam culture, so Ma'am, I want to know about how is it related to Madhubani paintings?
Which? Oh, Tessa's? Yes. Okay, I can't. Wait, hold on. Okay, it's fine. We'll get to the slide. So what Tessa does is she takes archival photos, so photos that she found from these postcards, but then she superimposes them on a background and with a border where she uses methods of Madhubani painting and drawing, and in combination with Nigerian forms of drawing, because it kind of honors both of her forms of ancestry. So she's interested in Madhubani. I think, like, you know, it's not the same as being trained and going to visit and really knowing everything about it, but it's understanding and honoring a part of her culture, because she also understands that, and just so you can see it. Thanks. It's just so you understand that she can honor her ancestry. So she has a few examples like this. If you Google her work, you can see, and she also talks about using methodology from
She has a link with Madhubani.
She has a link with Indo-Caribbean heritage that would have also, I think, come from the region. So that's why she finds it very important to have this also reflected in her work. So again, you know, this is a really layered piece with the archive, with Nigerian style, with Madhubani painting, to kind of, like she says, to avoid flattening women's lives and cultural experiences. So you see it all kind of interacting together. Yes?
If you see the geographical distribution of people who went from Bihar and Eastern UP, it was predominantly Bhojpuri area, not Mithila area or other area. We have 3-4 cultural zones. But you see, you know, if you see the analysis, now we are coming with that book, we'll give you that book.
Yes, wonderful.
So it says, you know, if it says, because Eastern UP also is Bhojpuri, this part of Bihar was Bhojpuri, so Bhojpuri became the predominant language in all these places, where Biharis and UP people were. So Bhojpuri became that predominantly that language. But here it also resulted into developing Videsia, you know, style of singing and all that.
Exactly.
I don't know whether that is still popular there, but Mauritius I found some Videsia. I don't know Suriname, because you know that separation, the songs based on separation.
Yes.
Wife remained here, husband has gone, or something.
So we do have those folk songs in Suriname. They do have those folk songs in Suriname as well, and ones that are really specifically related to the experience of migrating and traveling, also related to work, so doing plantation work. You also have that in Guyana, that there were folk songs. So Gayatri Bahadur's book, she also makes reference to these kinds of folk songs in Guyana.
He took an exhibition of Sita to Goa, Mr. Jha, and वहाँ बताओ क्या response था? वहाँ response जो था वो कुछ लोग जो आ रहा था visitors, तो क्या था लोग they are able to connect to राम सीता समझ रहा था, देख रहा था कि नहीं समझ रहा था?
Connect हो रहा.
They were
Connected with.
because we did 1 month exhibition there
In Mauritius.
in Guyana.
Oh, in Guyana, in British Guyana.
Yes.
Attached, emotionally attached with Rama and Sita.
Yeah.
They also have Ramayana, etc. So
Yeah.
there was a demand, and we sent that beautifully curated exhibition.
And that's true. I mean, in Suriname also, Ramayana is super popular. Ram worship is very popular. Guyana, Mauritius.
All people listen the Rafi, Lata, and the Indian
Yeah.
song.
Yes, yes.
Each and every song.
And really, the old golden age of Bollywood, exactly, Muhammad Rafi, Lata Mangeshkar.
And other Bhojpuri songs also.
So these things are all, they're still super popular, and they're also a way, even across generations, for people to kind of relate.
Especially they see vegetarian temples, marriage rituals, and
Yeah.
some sanskar, the mundan. This is also continued. That time the totally drapery or garments as like Indians. Mentioned.
Yes, I also saw that in Suriname. So I visited many temples. I went to Mudan Sanskar. A woman that I met invited me, and it was very interesting to see. It was a ritual, but of course it also interacted with local Surinamese culture, and also the way that people were dancing and the songs that they were singing. But the ritual itself, of course, was also very much like what I had experienced in other places around this. So all of these things, indeed, they're very seriously taken. They're part of culture, and things. There might be differences, but you also see quite some similarities as well. So a lot of things that remain as well as interact.
How does caste then function in
That place only the Indian is the one caste. No Hindu, no Muslim.
No, because you take the Kala Pani, you take the journey, and it is like it was meant that when you take the Kala Pani journey, that your caste is lost because you travel like people from all castes travel. It was one of the reasons why people couldn't come back, because here people started like looking down on the people who went back, because now like they had lost their like caste nest. But like, did like new form of caste come up, or like what is like the caste functionality in?
That is a really interesting question, and it's quite complex. And across historical moments, there are differences. You're completely right. So the crossing of the Kalapani was a major taboo. And as soon as people were put into depots, because the depots, they would leave from Calcutta. So the laborers would come from Bihar, they would be taken to Calcutta, and they would wait until the boats came. Already in those depots, people are interacting. You cannot maintain your caste. It just doesn't happen. So they say as soon as you get onto the depot, the ship as well, of course, a lot of those things disappear. You're eating, you're speaking, you're interacting with people from different communities. So it disappears, for better, for worse, for whoever. Now, when you see people coming into the Caribbean, they're still retaining certain rituals and certain things, but often people are doing it themselves. They're finding different kinds of ritual specialists. But there is historically this idea that people from priestly castes, Brahmins, did migrate to be able to fill and do that work in the Caribbean. So what happens is a caste of Brahmins kind of develops, which you can still see in parts of the Caribbean. There are people who will be very proud of that Brahmin heritage, and then the rest of the caste kind of fall outside of it. And it's sort of the idea that Brahmins do ritual work and other people don't. Although, what I have seen in Suriname is that everyone participates in ritual, that there aren't those kinds of taboos that you see. So when you go to a temple, anyone can approach the god, anyone can do a ritual, but there will also be priests there. And depending on how strict you are, depending on how you want to identify yourself, I find the people who are, really protective over Brahmanism in the Caribbean tend to be people who identify as Brahmins. No surprise there, right? And other people who will completely contest that and say, well, that doesn't actually exist in the Caribbean. We got rid of that, actually maybe it's for the better because we don't have this kind of social inequality. Like you were just saying, it's sort of we're all one people and we get rid of it. So it really depends on who you speak to. But historically, you see a Brahmin kind of caste. Yeah, it does migrate, but it doesn't stratify itself and repeat itself.
It had an inherent problem because all those permits, that one page thing, you had to declare caste is declared.
Yes.
So that is start with that. But what happened really in reality is you went to adverse condition. So there is a great cohesion. All those barriers, hierarchy, and all that break, and you have to live together.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you have to fight together. So to survive, so that reduced that all those caste hierarchies that we have. I'll give you one example. Like in Australia, when we used to have cricket matches, so Indians will support even Pakistanis, and Pakistanis will say Australia or England or anything. So you become one subcontinent. Otherwise, if thirdly, when our chief minister went to Mauritius, we went to that famous Shiv Mandir, Ganga Talab.
Yep.
You have a huge statue of Shankar, and we did one big ritual. क्या संस्कार बोलते हैं जब पूरा पानी वानी डाला जाता है तो शंकर भगवान में क्या होता है अपने रुद्राभिषेक. We did रुद्राभिषेक there. So very interesting adaptation. So that Pandit came, so I somehow befriended him. He told me the story when they were coming on the boat. There was a Brahmin in that boat knowing rituals. He died. But he was a barber, he was Hajam, who was supporting that Pandit in doing all those rituals. And he knew all those rituals. So when he landed, he declared himself that he is Brahmin. And that bugger was Pujari there. He was the Pujari now because he knew all those rituals. And so because of adversity and fighting together, living together, all those things, and because they were already seeing the bad aspect of caste hierarchy from their native place, so they got a chance. So caste system reduced very drastically. That has been my experience.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's just that we can't say it disappears completely because you do have people who are identifying themselves as Brahmin. There are people who are more protective of it, but it's absolutely very, very differently stratified. And yes, in the honor of solidarity, as we're talking about, in order to be in solidarity with each other, you had to get rid of these kinds of caste biases. Exactly.
I'd like to ask you one thing about tradition. Tradition is dynamic, ongoing. So I wonder what negotiations are going on between tradition and modernity in the present context.
Yeah, I think in the Dutch context or in Suriname or
in the entire Caribbean.
I mean, it's hard to say for the entire Caribbean, but I mean, what you have is, I think, tradition and understanding where you come from is very important, but also understanding that when your ancestors left, they left something behind, they brought it, and it interacted in a different way. So I think if you're talking about modernity, a lot of people that I've spoken to see it as this kind of interaction of cultures and understanding that histories. Yes, we're Indian, but we're Indian in the Caribbean, and that means something, and that meant we did different things to our tradition. And that doesn't mean we're lesser, that doesn't mean we're inauthentic. It's just the reality of our experience. And I think it also, one thing about the Caribbean is it responds to what colonial rule was doing at the time, just like what happens here in India, right? A lot of traditions, rituals become drastically changed under colonial rule because we absorb certain ideas, or there's a certain idea of what's modern, what's not anymore. The same thing happens in the Caribbean. I had a really interesting conversation when I was in Suriname last with someone. We were talking about Kali Puja. I'm talking about, I was there for Navaratri. That's what it was. And a man just really like casually mentioned and said something about sacrifice. He's like, oh yeah, but we don't do that anymore. Because that was bad. That was really bad. It's good we don't do that anymore. And that actually is it's a colonial mentality, because the colonial mentality came in and put a ban on those kinds of things, right? Especially related to goddess worship, we know through history. But that was something that also trickled down in the Caribbean. So the same sort of mentality, the same sort of rules were enforced there. And so it's considered now, okay, we're modern, our religion is modernized, we don't do that kind of thing anymore, we do other things.
So So in a way, it's kind of dissociation from their own identity because they want to adjust with the new environment. So they say that they're modern now, and or are they able to practice their traditions? They have all these migrant people. They have achieved a lot. We even have a prime minister. But what about that inner sense of displacement because they know that they don't belong there truly? When they start feeling they belong there, something will happen from the actual natives over there. So how about practicing their own traditions? Are they free to do that?
I think for a long time, yes, in terms of religion, like I can speak to it from this angle. Suriname also, the Dutch, having learned the lesson of trying to ban certain practices on plantations, were much more open when Indian indentured laborers and Javanese indentured laborers came. They were more permissive because they knew this could lead to something where work would be stopped. This could lead to uprisings and things. So not everything was allowed, but yes, they could practice their religion. In Trinidad, there were a lot of things that were banned, like Muharram was officially kind of banned. And I think, now, I'm not from the Caribbean, so I can't speak to what happens internally. But I think what is very interesting, especially going through Suriname, is how many temples, how many mosques are there. Suriname is also known as being, I think it's the only country in the world where there's a synagogue and a mosque beside each other. They share a parking lot. And then there's a church down the road. Like the religious diversity is very strong and people feel that freedom of religion. I think a dissociation from self, we're talking about, there are ruptures in history. There are moments that you can't fill in. There are gaps, right? And that is something that also exists if you're talking about the history of formerly enslaved Africans that were taken to the Caribbean. There is a rupture between where they came from and where they ended up, right? And then that's why I'm interested in these kinds of artists like Tessa, Sarojini, Nasrina, because they address those gaps, not from the position of victimhood, not necessarily even from the position of loss, but from the position of what is our future going to look like. Exactly, adaptability, future orientation. So not ignoring the history of the gaps, but thinking creatively, imaginatively about what that could be. There's a really amazing historian named Saidia Hartman, working out of the United States, who's African American. And she coined a term called critical fabulation. And she's a historian as disciplined as anyone, being in the archive. But she realizes that for African American women especially, there are gaps in the archive and the history. So she uses fiction and fabulation based on what she's read to repair some of these ruptures. So interesting what you say about the Madhubani, that maybe Tessa doesn't come from a region where Madhubani would have been popular, but she understands it as an art form that has a significance related to a kind of Indianness she's putting together. And so in that way, it makes sense in this history. It does something in that history. Saidia Hartman does the same thing, where she writes these beautiful stories and histories of women who've often been silenced by using fiction, fabulation alongside the archive. So if anyone is interested in that kind of work, I would really recommend looking at Saidia Hartman's history writing.
It is like the reintegration and reanimation of that culture within the present, that cultural memory in the present cultural context. That's what I think BSM calls dispossessed rootedness.
Yes, yes. I think there are a lot of parallels there as well. And I think that maybe in earlier works, Saidia Hartman might think about dispossession in that way, but I think there's something very hopeful in the work of Sarojini and Nasrina and this generation now who's doing this work, this memory work, because it's a coming to terms with where they come from and not wanting to mourn an ancestry, but understanding it as how the world works, and the world has been unequal. Colonialism brought out these kinds of things. We know, we're sitting here as Indians, right? We understand what this can do. And then that post-colonial moment also can create unnecessary divides and understandings of each other. But what are we going to do as we move into the future? right? And then these are some artistic strategies of how we could do that.
To remove the biases, to decolonize.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Also, like their identities are no longer homogeneous, right? There's a lot of intersectionality. So what they can't like strictly purify what they need to follow or like something that they need to go back to or practice, because there is a lot of intersection. They are Caribbean also. They like their ancestry might be like from India, but their present is also like rooted in the place that they are right now.
Absolutely.
Like, there's also like a lot of intersectionality there.
Yeah, and you know the question about what is Suriname like now? Like this is also what you see. You see people who have these different intersecting cultures and embody it and live it, and that's like their life. And that's what I think you see when you're in the Caribbean that can be so extraordinary.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
You answered a lot of our queries and questions.
It was
But
wonderful.
they are not museums. The world has globalized, no? So those places,
No, indeed.
they are not. India here also, no? We were thinking once, people will, they want to see rural India, poor state, they will come to Bihar. But it's not like
No.
And that is proved by pandemic. It happened everywhere.
Yeah, that's also true. It didn't discriminate, right?
It did not discriminate, it happened everywhere. So we all are moving,
Exactly, towards the globe.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you
Very
so
good.
much, everyone. That was brilliant.
We'll have some of tea or coffee outside.
Hey, thank you. हम फिर बात करते हैं.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. You're the best. And it's huge. I love it.